It's funny how we often grow up thinking we know everything about our families, how much we think we're seen, understood, and valued. For years, I was sure that my family knew me. They didn't. It wasn't until I stumbled upon the truth, a truth that shook everything I believed about my relationship with my mother and my sister, that I realized how little I really knew about the inner workings of our household. Growing up, it wasn't that we were rich, but we weren't poor either. My mom always worked hard, and my dad, though mostly absent, had left us with a decent inheritance when he passed away. I remember being so grateful for what he had left behind, enough to cover our expenses, pay off the house, and for me, a future I could build upon. It wasn't a fortune, but it was more than enough for a comfortable life. My sister, on the other hand, had always been the golden child, the one who got the most attention, the one with the most extravagant tastes, the one who never had to ask for anything because she always got it. It wasn't jealousy that I felt, it was frustration, confusion, and a growing resentment for how things were handled in our family. At first, I thought I was imagining things, that I was making it up in my head, but the signs were there. And after months of slowly noticing inconsistencies, I finally understood what had happened. It started when my sister got engaged. I didn't think much of it at first. I mean, she was always the center of attention, and this wedding would be another step in the ongoing parade of milestones in her life. However, there was something strange about the way things began unfolding. My mom seemed more excited than usual. Too excited. As the wedding plans moved forward, it became clear that my mother was more than just involved. She was investing, physically and emotionally, in this event in a way that was excessive even for her. It wasn't until I had a casual conversation with a friend that I realized what was going on. She casually mentioned the amount of money my mother had spent on the wedding, and that's when the first seed of doubt was planted. She didn't mention numbers specifically, but there was an unspoken understanding in her tone. She knew something that I didn't. When I finally confronted my mother about it, she shrugged it off, saying that this was a once-in-a-lifetime event for my sister, and that the expenses would be worth it. But something didn't sit right with me. She had mentioned her expenses with no clear breakdown. I began to suspect that maybe the real cost wasn't just a lavish wedding, but the amount of money that had been siphoned from what was supposed to be my inheritance, the inheritance my father had set up for me, for my future. Over the next few weeks, I spent more time studying the financial documents, records of accounts, and everything I could get my hands on. The deeper I dug, the more my suspicions were confirmed. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had been spent from the account, but it wasn't just the amount, it was the timing that struck me. These were funds that had been transferred in a pattern, just before major wedding purchases were made, and there was no mention of any of it in the conversations I had had with my mother. That was when it hit me. I knew now that my inheritance, the one I had been counting on, the one I had believed would give me the chance to build my future, was slowly being drained by my mother to pay for my sister's lavish wedding. It was one thing for my sister to want an extravagant celebration, but it was entirely another for my mother to knowingly sacrifice my financial future to make her daughter's dream wedding come true. For the first time in my life, I felt completely betrayed. My mother had been acting as though everything was fine, like she had all the control over the money, but I was the one who would ultimately be affected by her decisions. I couldn't understand how she thought I wouldn't notice, how she believed she could spend my money without a second thought. But now that I had all the proof I needed, I knew I had to take action. This wasn't just about money, it was about respect, integrity, and holding my ground when everything I had believed in had been shattered. The day I froze the account was one I'll never forget. I had gone through all the proper channels, double-checked the legal documents, and ensured I had the right to take this step. When I called the bank and made my request to freeze the account, I felt a mix of relief and guilt, but it was only a momentary hesitation. I had already been wronged, and now I had to stand firm in my decision. In that moment, I realized the power I had, what I had the right to protect. It wasn't just the money, it was my right to determine my future, to not be held hostage by my mother's decisions. I was no longer a passive player in my own life, waiting for someone else to decide my fate. My mother's response to this was everything I expected. She was furious when she found out the account had been frozen. But I didn't care. I couldn't be swayed anymore. The truth was out, and I wasn't going to be a pawn in her game. I had been patient, forgiving, and understanding for too long. But now, I was taking control. Things didn't end there. Of course, I still had to face my mother's anger and my sister's disappointment. The wedding plans were thrown into disarray, and the reality of what had happened slowly began to sink in for everyone. My sister didn't understand why I had done what I had. She had always been the favored one, the one who received the most, and the one who never had to work hard for anything. To her, this was just another obstacle in her path to a perfect wedding. But for me, it was the end of an era. I had spent years feeling overlooked, unseen, and unimportant. Now, I was standing up for myself in a way I never had before. And as my family tried to mend the situation, I stayed resolute. The freeze on the account stayed in place. And I knew that my future, no matter what happened from here on out, was no longer at the mercy of my mother's decisions. I had made a choice that would change everything. And though it wasn't easy, I knew it was the right one. As the days went on, I couldn't ignore the way my family was responding to the news. My mother's anger was palpable. She was fuming, pacing around the house, calling anyone who would listen to her, trying to explain how ungrateful I was being. She couldn't understand why I was upset. To her, it was just a wedding. It was what my sister deserved. And it wasn't like I was going to need that money anytime soon, right? But I wasn't just upset about the money. It was deeper than that. It was the years of feeling overlooked, the constant sense of not being enough, and the crushing realization that my family's love was conditional, tied to money, status, and how well you fit into the role they assigned to you. My sister had always been the golden child, the one everyone doted on. And me? I was just the afterthought, the one who never asked for anything, but always ended up having to fight for the scraps. As the wedding date grew closer, the tension escalated. My mother was relentless in her efforts to make me feel guilty for what I had done. And while I couldn't deny feeling a pang of sadness at the situation, I couldn't back down. This wasn't just about money. It was about standing up for myself. For the years I had spent silently accepting her neglect, her manipulation, and her preferential treatment toward my sister. But my sister was angry too. She wasn't angry about the money, not directly. Anyway, she was angry that I had ruined her wedding. To her, this was the ultimate betrayal. She had been counting on the lavish celebration, the dream wedding she had envisioned since she was a little girl. And here I was, pulling the rug out from under her. It didn't matter that she didn't know the truth about how everything had gone down, about how her dream wedding was funded on the back of my future. All that mattered to her was that I had destroyed her plans. I knew the guilt was coming, that nagging feeling, the voice in my head reminding me of how things used to be before all of this. I had always tried to be the peacemaker, the one who avoided conflict at all costs. I didn't want to be the villain in this story, but at that moment, I was forced to be. My mother and sister might never forgive me, but I knew that I couldn't go on living in the shadow of their expectations. The real breaking point came when my mom tried to get around the freeze. She contacted the bank, trying to convince them to reverse the action, to unlock the account, telling them that she had my consent. It was maddening to hear the lies she spun to try and get what she wanted. When I found out, I was furious, but not surprised. This was exactly how she had always operated, using manipulation, guilt, and deceit to bend others to her will. But this time, I wasn't going to let it slide. I called the bank myself, this time making sure they knew exactly what was going on. I was no longer going to let her treat me like I didn't exist, like my financial future didn't matter. It wasn't just about the money, it was about my sense of self-worth. The years of sacrifice, of constantly putting others before myself, had to stop. I was done playing by her rules. But even with the account still frozen, the consequences were far-reaching. My mother, furious at my insubordination, tried to make it seem like I was ruining the family. She painted me as the villain, the one who couldn't be trusted. My sister, unable to see past her own desires, sided with her. And before long, I felt like I was standing alone in a sea of disappointment and anger. I didn't care anymore. The first few days after the freeze were the hardest. I could hear my mother's voice echoing through the house as she ranted about how I had destroyed everything. She was relentless, calling everyone we knew to tell them about the situation, hoping to garner support for her side of the story. She portrayed me as selfish, ungrateful, and completely out of line. My sister, too, didn't understand. She was upset. But more than that, she felt entitled to what she had asked for. She believed that a wedding was her right, and she couldn't fathom why I would step in and stop it. But as the days turned into weeks, something shifted. My family's anger started to subside, and a certain calmness washed over me. I realized that what I had done wasn't just about money, it was about my independence, my right to decide my future, to take control over my own destiny, without being dragged down by the weight of my family's expectations. I had made a decision that would forever change the course of my life. The account remained frozen, and while it wasn't an easy path, it felt like the right one. I had learned that the only way to move forward was to break free from the hold my family had over me. And as for the wedding, it never happened. With the account frozen, my sister had no choice but to scale back her plans. The extravagant event she had envisioned was reduced to a small ceremony. And while it wasn't the grand spectacle she had hoped for, it was still a wedding. And maybe, just maybe, She would learn that sometimes the things you want most aren't always meant to be. But for me, this was about reclaiming my life. No longer would I allow my family to dictate my worth. No longer would I sacrifice my future to please them. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was one I had to make. For the first time in my life, I was putting myself first. As the months went by, things slowly began to settle. My family's anger simmered down, but the damage was done. My mother and sister never fully understood why I had acted the way I did, but I couldn't let that stop me from moving forward. The wedding was never rescheduled, and my sister eventually planned a much smaller ceremony. It wasn't the lavish affair she had dreamed of, but it was a peaceful event, one without the chaos and manipulation that had once dominated our family. I stayed true to my decision, even though it meant distancing myself from the toxic patterns that had always been there. The money was still frozen, and my future was mine to build. I realized that I had made the right choice, not just for the money, but for my own happiness and independence. It was a painful lesson, but it was one that ultimately led me to a place where I no longer had to put myself second. In the end, I was free,